the most contentious issue is the territory that Ukraine would be asked to cede. That's part of the peace in Ukraine bucket. How do you get there? Well, Ukraine has to give up some additional territory.
The United States then has drafted a 28-point peace plan for Ukraine after secret talks with Russian negotiators. The new proposals reportedly involve the country ceding more territory in the east, with Russia gaining full control of the Donbas region. Here's Donald Trump talking about ending the war in the last few hours.
8 raging conflicts, 8 wars. I've settled 8 wars. I have 1 to go. You know what that one is. I thought that was going to be my easy one because I have a good relationship with President Putin, but I'm a little disappointed in President Putin right now. He knows that. I thought that was going to be the easy one.
Well, the news was broken by the US political website Axios. David Lawler is their national security editor. He co-wrote the story. Good evening to you.
Great to be with you.
Thanks so much, David. You've seen sight of this 28-point peace plan, haven't you?
We haven't seen the text of it. It's been described to us by U.S. officials, and also we spoke to the Russian envoy, who was very much involved in the crafting of this plan. That's one of the controversies that surrounds it, that Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy, sat down over the course of 3 days with his Russian counterpart and discussed the details before they actually looped in the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been briefed on the plan now, but of course, a lot of people up in arms about the fact that this comes across as a U.S.-Russia plan for Ukraine rather than one that Ukraine has had a lot of input on the front end.
Yeah, this was cooked up at the end of October. Why do you think Steve Witkoff or Donald Trump even went with that move to create something with Russia and then present it to Ukraine rather than the other way around?
Almost every piece of this is modeled on what they did in Gaza. You even have some of the same mediators. They've involved the Qataris and the Turks behind the scenes. These talks with the Ukrainians are supposed to happen in Istanbul, mediated by the Turks. The Qataris have been involved in some of these meetings. So the idea is you start with the stronger party to the conflict. In that case, it was Israel. In this case, it's Russia. You get to a place where, yes, they have to make 1 or 2 concessions, but it's a deal that they can live with. And then you turn to the other party to the conflict who, at least from the U.S. perspective, has a little bit less leverage, the Ukrainians, and you try to get them to agree. And the U.S. official we quoted said pretty bluntly, this territory we're asking Ukraine to give up, we think they're going to lose it anyways if they keep fighting the Russians, and so they're better off making a deal now. So they obviously decided to get some Russian buy-in on the front end. That's not to say that the Kremlin is universally on board or has agreed to it, but they've certainly consulted the Russians on the front end, and then you take that to the Ukrainians. So that's the way they did it on Gaza. That's the way they're trying to do it on Ukraine.
Let's just talk about what's in it. You point out that there are sort of 4 general areas here: peace in Ukraine, security guarantees, security in Europe, and future US relations with Russia and Ukraine. Let's just break into that, because there's been a bit more detail this evening, hasn't there?
Yeah, my colleague Barak Ravid, I was involved in getting that story across the line. We've just published in the last couple hours a more detailed picture of what's in the deal. The most contentious issue is the territory that Ukraine would be asked to cede. That's part of the peace in Ukraine bucket. How do you get there? Well, Ukraine has to give up some additional territory. The security guarantees part, little bit less fleshed out, at least in the descriptions that we've got from U.S. officials. They will make a pledge of some sort that the U.S. will prevent Russia from further aggression, not just against Ukraine, but against the European continent generally. But will that be backed up by troops or planes in the air or anything more concrete than words? We don't know yet. We at Axios don't know yet. Somebody might know. We don't know. And then there are the additional pieces around future U.S. relations with Russia. Russia wants to normalize ties with the U.S. They want to start their economic engine going again, and also some ideas about how peace in Europe can be achieved longer term. So it's a very ambitious, broad set of agreements. But if you just start at the very top on the issue of territory, the Ukrainians, at least up to now, have not been willing to make the kinds of concessions that the U.S. is planning to ask them to make.
Yeah, so that's in eastern Ukraine, and that will involve some of the areas that Russia invaded as a result of this most recent incursion. It's the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Not all of those territories entirely. So we're still unsure, really, on sort of how much territory Ukraine would have to give over, how much has been annexed by Russia already, and whether there's additional territory that is still in Ukrainian hands but Russia wants. I mean, have we got any idea on that at all, David?
Yes, so the breakdown is Donetsk and Luhansk, which collectively are known as the Donbas. Ukraine has to cede that all together to Russia. So Russia currently has around 86% of the land there. They would get 100%. And the areas that are currently contested between the sides would become a sort of demilitarized zone, but within Russian sovereignty. So that's the toughest pill to swallow. The other two regions that you mentioned where Russia has made gains, those would be frozen along the current line of contact. There's even a possibility of Russia giving up bits of territory to sort of clean up the map a little bit there. And so you would have, at least from the U.S. perspective, the Donbas region would just become part of Russia. The Ukrainians would not be asked to recognize that under law, but they would be asked to basically concede it, de facto, that they're not going to get this land back. And so, again, that would be an incredibly tough pill for the Ukrainians to swallow.
So not ceded by law. So in other words, in terms of the international perspective, that territory, let's just talk about the Donbass, would still be Ukrainian territory, but in Russia's eyes, it would be Russian territory. Is that because there have been discussions along these lines before, haven't there? How does the US interpret that territory? How does Russia interpret that territory? How does the rest of the world interpret it?
The U.S. would recognize that territory as Russian. Russia would, of course, continue to claim that territory as Russian. Ukraine would consider it part of their own territory, on the map, but not, sort of on the ground. And then the U.S., the plan says that other countries, in addition to the U.S. and Russia, would recognize the Donbass as part of Russia, whether the U.K., whether other prominent backers of Ukraine and Europe would concede to that point. I find it pretty unlikely, and so I don't know who those other countries are that would recognize it. But the big thing is that the U.S. would recognize it, and Ukraine would stop trying to take it back, basically.
And Ukraine would also have to cede some weapons as well. Any more detail on that?
Yeah, so this was not told to us. Just sort of transparency in the reporting process. The U.S. official we spoke to did not mention that there would be limitations on the Ukrainian military, but a Ukrainian source we spoke to said, yeah, and they're even asking us to give up some of our long-range weapons and to make concessions in terms of sort of the future of the Ukrainian military post-war, which are things that the Russians have asked for, but that have never really been on the table in previous agreements that the Western mediators have sort of considered. So again, I think that's something that, if this is a serious plan, if this moves forward, I have a very hard time seeing the Ukrainians, or in fact their European backers, agreeing to that piece of the deal, that it would be a smaller and weaker Ukrainian military after the war.
Because that affects Europe, and we should mention the absence of Europe completely in this plan, in any negotiations at all. Now, Donald Trump fancies himself as a man who ends wars. He's had his own opinions, his own things to say about NATO and the lack of defensive support from Europe to Ukraine, or the mismatch in support when you compare the US to what Europe has had to contribute. But that's an interesting point to this as well, that he hasn't, as yet, or even along any part of this journey, tried to get Europe on side. Is that because Donald Trump will just think that that's muddying the waters, that it's just going to drag those negotiations back?
Not only is Europe not involved in these talks, but the U.S. is disregarding the talks that the U.K. was involved with, right, to draft this Gaza-style peace plan for Ukraine. The Brits have spoken to the Ukrainians and other partners about that. I think the U.S., at least the U.S. official we spoke to, sees that plan as a non-starter, not going anywhere. The Russians won't accept it. So, they're working with the partners they worked on Gaza particularly closely with, and they're not working with the countries that have had a say in this mediation between Ukraine and Russia in the past. That includes UK, France,
Mm.
Germany. Of course, there are meetings, there are discussions that involve all of those countries, but in this particular plan, there has been no input from the European partners.
And President Zelensky met Turkey today. I gather that US army officials are in Ukraine, in Kyiv, to speak to Zelensky tomorrow. No doubt this will be the topic of conversation.
Indeed, and Witkoff himself was supposed to meet Zelensky. He was going to go to meet Zelensky as part of this same trip when he's in Turkey, and that meeting has fallen apart. Differing opinions on why, but the U.S. side is that Zelensky was not going to engage seriously with this U.S. plan, and so the meeting fell apart on those terms. There will be folks from the Pentagon meeting with the Ukrainians. So there are discussions, military to military discussions ongoing. I've seen some folks make the argument that the Witkoff plan is not the only show in town, that there's other constituencies within the U.S. government who see this differently. And sure, Witkoff's trying this thing, but the Ukrainians have better friends than Witkoff internally in the U.S. government. That's an argument some are making. It remains to be seen how far the Witkoff plan goes, but it does, Trump chose Steve Witkoff to negotiate peace in Ukraine. So he has the president's mandate to go out and do this. But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic where you've got, different constituencies within the Ukrainian government and the U.S. government holding meetings. Are they all speaking out of the same side of their mouth when they, get behind closed doors? Whether that's the Ukrainians and also the Americans, is the Pentagon singing the same tune as Witkoff is? We're not in the room, so we don't
Yeah.
have full transparency into all that.